Good afternoon, everyone. Here's an update pertaining to China for August 18th. So China has announced more military drills to take place around Taiwan in response to a couple of things. The first being renewed trade efforts between Taiwan and the U.S. China doesn't like that because China wants to be involved in all Taiwan trade because they believe Taiwan is a part of China, whereas the U.S. and Taiwan have bilateral trade agreements separate from China. Regardless of what the U.S. determines is China's stance on Taiwan in that regard. Additionally, U.S. lawmakers arrived in Taiwan on Monday to speak with the Taiwanese president. Four U.S. lawmakers and a representative from American Samoa are in the country to discuss the future of U.S.-Taiwan relations, which obviously frustrates China as well, although they're not making as much of a fit about it as when Nancy Pelosi went, nor is the media, frankly. I would bet a lot of you didn't even know that we sent another delegation to Taiwan because it's just not being reported on for some reason. Chinese troops will travel to Russia to take part in a joint military exercise that will start at the end of this month. This is according to the Beijing Defense Ministry. Other participants will be India, Belarus, Mongolia, Tajikistan, and some other minor countries as well. Beijing said that the decision to hold the joint exercises was unrelated to the current international and regional situation with Ukraine. And actually, these have been planned for a while. This is actually an annual training event that Russia and China hold. They held this a year ago, and it involves about 10,000 troops. Interestingly, India, Tajikistan, and Mongolia also train with the U.S. as well. So not a huge amount of concern here. This is just a standard training protocol between those countries. Moving on, in a UN report from the UN General Assembly, it is said that they have a reasonable belief that forced labor is taking place in China's far western region of Xinjiang. And I have to say, you fucking think? I mean, do you not have eyes and it took you this long to finally say something? Anyways, China is claiming it provides employment, vocational and skills training for those involved in these work education camps, is frankly what they're called. And while the UN agreed that that may be so, it also is the participation in such camps is forced, which is slavery. So, I mean, I'm sure like white people in the South said, we were giving Africans great skills, but they were still slaves. Anyways, they went on to say further, given the nature and extent of the powers exercised over the workers during the forced labor, including excessive surveillance, abusive living and working conditions, restrictions of movement, internment, threats of physical or sexual violence, and other inhumane and degrading treatment, this is definitely slavery and forced labor. So the findings have come after the United States, Canada, European Union, and the United Kingdom in recent years imposed sanctions on officials and businesses linked to such human rights violations in the region. Moving on, updated census information shows China likely overcounted its population by 100 million people. This is evident when reported growth rates and actual birth rates are not matching up. Fuxian Yi, a scientist studying Chinese population and demographic information from the University of Wisconsin, said China's population is likely only 1.28 billion, not 1.41 billion. This means China likely hit its highest population in 2020 and will see declines over the next 60 years, with their population potentially being halved as early as 2070. This just isn't just a problem in just demographics. This is kind of a problem is how nations die economically. There's no recovery, there's no method, or there's no economics to overcome having your population. There's just no way to do it. So this is something that's quite dire for China going forward, and it's only going to get worse year over year as we move forward. Meanwhile, Russia is increasingly facing its own demographic crisis, so much so that the Kremlin is offering a hero's medal and $16,000 to women who have 10 kids. The stipulation is the woman must raise them and they must survive. So it's just they're trying to avoid women just getting pregnant, popping out a kid, then doing it again just to get $16,000. So the kids must survive and they must be raised by the woman in a relatively proper manner, according to them. But yeah, $1,600 per year, and that's $1,600 American per kid, not per year. $1,600 per kid. That's silly. I think my 4 kids cost me like $30,000 a year, if not more. So yeah, exactly no women are probably going to take the Kremlin up on that. Speaking of what the demographic problem in China is going to cause, Chinese economic growth projections for 2022 have been slashed to around 2.8%. Now, this isn't obviously because of the demographic situation. That's a situation we're on the forefront of. That's going to be a problem later on. The target for this year was 5.5%. At 2.8%, that's well off. I mean, this is due to the contractions in real estate market as a percentage of GDP. The real estate market in China traditionally held a significant portion, and that's shrinking. Their zero COVID policy is obviously a problem, and I've talked about that before. Also, something I've talked about before as well is Western investors are leaving the country. Now, the Chinese are expected to still surpass the U.S. growth rate of 2%, but the U.S. is not going to so severely miss its projections. Now, the U.S. originally projected 2.6% growth roughly in there, and at 2% growth, that's not terribly far off, whereas missing your mark by almost 3% is pretty significant. Now, the issue is, this isn't a problem for China. This isn't just a problem for the U.S. This is a global problem. The global economy looks pretty gloomy and uncertain as the U.S., China, and Europe are all facing economic downturns. This year's global growth will slow to 2.6%. It was like 5.8% last year. Now, this is because obviously the war in Ukraine and the energy disruptions to Europe that's causing inflation has been much harder to control than anticipated in the U.S. And this is because the labor market came roaring back and is really tight. So it's driving prices higher as well as other things involved as well. The tighter global financial conditions are caused by Chinese overlending, which means a lot of bankers and lenders are kind of tightening their purse strings. So a lot of Chinese-induced debt distresses in emerging markets is coming specifically in developing economies in Asia and Africa. You can see an example of this in Sri Lanka. Also, and I've talked about this a half a dozen times, the COVID-19 lockdowns are just doing them no good and are further suppressing Chinese growth. Finally, there's just geopolitical fragmentation and the global trade and cooperation is falling apart. And this is coming from countries specifically in Europe with the Russia situation. And actually, the U.S. is benefiting from this, which is part of the reason the inflation rate is higher is because people need to buy more things from the United States, driving prices up. In a plausible worst case scenario, it shows that the global growth decline will be about 2.6%, will decline to 2.6% this year and 2% in 2023. This would put growth at the bottom 10% since 1970. So it's not necessarily a good situation. And then finally, a study on the threat of nuclear war just came out, and it shows that the most likely nuclear conflict around the world would not involve North Korea, not China, not Russia, and not even the US, but conflict between India and Pakistan. And I completely agree with this. I've talked about this before. Now, the initial stages of such a conflict would immediately kill tens of millions, followed by hundreds of millions due to starvation. They estimate that roughly 2 billion people would die from a conflict between India and Pakistan. That's less than 3% of the world's stockpiles, and it could kill as much as 1/3 of the world's population within 2 years. And this is according to Rutgers University. However, a larger nuclear conflict between Russia and the U.S. could kill nearly 3/4 of the world's population, or a little over 5 billion people. And this was published on Monday in the journal Nature Food. Now, even a small fraction of these nuclear weapons would spark a massive firestorm, and I've talked about this before, and it would rapidly inject soot into the atmosphere. And this would touch off a huge cooling of the climate with temperatures dropping as much as 9 degrees Fahrenheit or roughly 5 degrees Celsius, if my Europe to US math is correct. They used climate models to project how much smoke would reach the stratosphere, which is where no precipitation would wash the smoke away and get rid of it. This would cause massive drops, up to 42% in the amount of crops that we could grow, which would affect fishing, which would affect other foodstuffs, and billions would die. Now, the projection shows that if India and Pakistan were to target urban centers with their roughly 250 and 100 kiloton nuclear weapons, about 127 million people would die immediately, followed by the 2 billion afterwards. Now, this is because an estimated 37 million tons of soot would be sent up into the atmosphere. And this isn't even taking into account the effect of increased ultraviolet radiation and other things. Now, mind you, this is somewhat hypothetical modeling, so the outcome could be less severe. And actually, researchers are saying if the models were to skew, they would skew to a more rosy picture. But overall, this is still not a great picture. And sorry to leave you with sad news like that.